Hey guys, it's Gars. I just wanted to make what is hopefully going to be a quick video on how to use Warcraft Logs. This is mostly just going to cover basics, but I hope it gives everybody the ability to go through their own logs and help themselves. And then if they still need help, then they can hopefully find somebody to help them. But I think it's important that if you're going to be raiding on any serious level, that you're able to really go through and use Warcraft Logs efficiently. That being said, Warcraft Logs is a tool, and like any tool, you have to use it properly for it to be useful. Yes, you can put a nail into a board with a screwdriver, but it works a whole lot better with a hammer. That being said, let's get into how to use Warcraft Logs. One of the first things you want to do when you're looking through logs is you want to make sure you're looking at the right fight. I don't mean this just in the sense that you don't know what fight to look at, but if you're looking to improve, different fights have different dynamics to them. If you want to improve your single target DPS, looking at a fight where you multi-dot or do a lot of AoE isn't going to help you. So identify where you're looking to improve and then find a fight that reflects that. I'm personally, for the purposes of demonstrating this, going to be using Fellhounds because I'll be using my old Brewmaster logs, and that is a fight with decent mobility, decent survivability checks. It's overall a good fight for me to use if I want a realistic representation of single target damage. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll go through some of that. So go ahead and we'll go through the comparison process. So in order to do a proper comparison, there's several steps of filtering you need to do. Like I said, I'm going to be using my Brewmaster logs. So the first thing I want to do is filter to my spec. The next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm filtering to my item level. I know that the last time we killed Mythic Hounds, I was 963. So that'll put me in the 962 to 960. Now that I have this up, it doesn't particularly impact me at this time, but I would really like to look through logs that are using the same legendaries as me. So in this case, I'm going to require Sal Salad Beam, and I'm going to require Dima's, nope, not Dima's Glacial Aegis. What am I thinking? Storm Stout's Last Grasp. Also, because I don't want to compare against the popular DPS trinkets, I'm going to exclude I have Command. Filter that out. And when you're doing an intense filter like this, it will take a little bit longer. Don't worry about it. So now I've filtered out. Now again, in my particular case, I know that I personally am running an Eye of Command, so this would be a really good log for me to look at because it's running the same two trinkets that I do, which already makes it a good comparison point. However, it is running a different talent selection for me. So that being said, I think I would rather go with this log. So now that I'm in this log, just looking at his log isn't going to be super useful to me on its own. So what I would like to do is do a comparison. Now the compare tool has a bunch of different ways that it can be used. However, this is the key code you're looking for. This is your Warcraft log ID code, 16 digits. You want to copy that. You're going to copy that because what we want to do is come over to your log, right? So this is the log Cloister posted. And I'm going to come over to the compare tool, and I'll go over the compare tool now that we're here. So the compare tool has a few different pieces to it. The first piece is the compare report, and that's what I'll ultimately be doing here, but I would like to cover the other features of it. So you can always compare within a given report, which is useful if you have two people playing the same spec. So, for example, we could do a comparison between Nurk and Tam. Would that be super useful? Maybe, but what can be a very useful tool is to go through and you can actually search for logs similar to yours. So if I filter by fight length, if I limit the raid size, which it's mythic, so I can actually set that to 0. If I want to keep it within 2 item levels of me, and I'd like it to be within the last 28 days, and I'm mostly concerned about getting damage returns on this. But as you can see, you could also filter it for healing and survivability. So you'll see on the far right column here, you get a match percentage, right? And what this is it's basically showing places of notable difference between these logs. Obviously, you want the highest match percentage that you can, But you'll quickly notice the sixth result is actually me myself. So that's the downside to using this tool, is that usually when you use it, it gets so specific that it tends to not be particularly useful if you're looking to make improvements in your rotation. So let's go back to doing a manual comparison. Remember, we copied that key earlier, so you're just going to paste that. And now we have this new combined log. You can tell if it successfully did this because you'll see different colored dots. So let's go to Fellhounds of Sargeras, and after doing so, as you can see, we now have my guild on the left and the blog I'm comparing to on the right. It's worth noting that I could have done the comparison from their log, and if I did that, their guild would be on the left, my guild would be on the right. It matters in terms of order and coloration which log you pick. It'll also matter for the purposes of watching the replay, but we'll get to that later. So there's several key components to breaking down a log. The first step you want to make is you want to find the person you want to compare yourself to. So in this case, since we're looking at my monk, we'll pull up Antlers. Then I need the monk I was comparing to, who is Sangmu. So let's pull him up as well. Now, by default, you can go to the summary tab. I recommend the summary tab as a default place to start because it's important to understand the context of a given set of logs. So in this case, I really want to know any stat differences or anything like that that would influence how we would perform. So as you can see, there's some stat differences here and they're worth exploring. I don't heavily want to go over my own logs just because that's not fruitful for everyone, but I'll break down this summary page. So it starts with player stats. Then you can see player talent differences. You can also see differences in the artifact. This can be very useful if you're on a class that has a particularly significant trait. So as you can see, he has one additional rank of facepalm. The gear that was equipped for the log will appear here. Then you can get a quick overview of damage by ability. And this is actually a very good way to start seeing any particular problems you might have with your rotation. So in this case, I'm already seeing that my Tiger Palm is low, my Keg Smash is low, my Blackout Strike is low, my Breath of Fire is almost exactly on point, which means somewhere in these three places is where I'm most likely to have a significant rotational difference. This already gives me a target place without having gone in detail on anything at all. Obviously, if you're a healer or if your self-healing is of question or of concern, you can of course come to healing by ability and healing done by ability, and this will obviously give you a breakdown of that. Similarly for damage taken, if you're a tank and you're like, what in the world keeps trucking me? This is another great place to start. I do think it's very weird, but that's a separate issue. Like I said, I don't want to go heavily over these logs. I'm more worried about showing how it's done. So now that I have a place to start, let's go ahead and look at damage done. So there's a lot of useful information you'll get from the table portion of damage done, and we'll go over tables, timelines, and events in a moment. So already just looking at this, my Tiger Palm casts are significantly higher than his. But I can see from this graph up here that my fight duration is also significantly longer, with his fight ending at 4:33 and ours continuing all the way to 5:47. So I go a full minute and 15 seconds almost longer than this guy does, which means some of my casts will be higher, but there's some things I can look at as an obvious point of concern. And these are the things you really want to focus on and begin trying to understand why these differences would happen. Particularly once you reassess something for fight duration, it can be very clear if you're having a priority issue in terms of your resource allocation or if you're simply having too much downtime in a fight. Even though I'm using a tank log, I really want to go over healing because it's a little more complicated to do. So, first off, when you're looking at healing, these two filters show you who's doing the healing. This down here underneath summary is where you can pick a healing target. So if I'm more worried about just seeing the healing I had coming in, this would show me my self healing. However, if I clear my filters, we can now see everybody's healing breakdown on me. And I apologize if any of the healers get offended on me putting them out there like this. Keep in mind this is Mythic Fellhounds, so the healers are separated into groups, which means not all the healers had access to me. But It is worth noting this can be a very useful tool both for tanks and healers, and it shows quite a bit of useful information. Obviously, this can be broken down further by picking specific abilities. You can also look at raw healing, which will show including overheal basically, which can be very useful at times if overhealing's of concern. And again, you can filter again to look at done by a specific ability, etc., etc. But that being said, the healing tab can be a little bit more complicated to look through, so just be careful that you're filtering your information properly anytime you're going through healing logs. So now I'm looking at the cast table. Now, the cast table is really useful after you've already established a place of concern in your rotation. So immediately, just from the summary tab as well as the damage done tab, I identified 3 spells I was pretty clearly not using correctly. Now, the table gives you a raw aggregate count. So of concern is that with a 1 second global cooldown on a fight that went more than a full minute longer, I actually only had a total of 39. I did the math. 39 additional cast, even though my global cooldown is only 1 second. This is already indicative that I'm having an uptime problem. So the table can be useful for identifying things like that. It additionally is useful for potentially looking at buff uptime, which I'll cover in a minute, uh, and debuff uptime in particular. So those are things you want to keep in mind. However, more useful than the table, in my opinion, is uh, the events tab can be slightly more useful. Basically, what the events tab does versus timelines, timeline gives you a literal timeline. It can graphically be very helpful. So in this case, I can actually visually see my rotation problem simply because it prioritizes by cast number. So I can already tell that because my Tiger Palm's on top and his Tiger Palm isn't, that was already a mistake that I made. Events I find to be a little more useful because it just gives you the timestamp on the left to right, which makes it, in my opinion, at times at least, a little bit more easy to use as a point of comparison. The next key piece I want to get into is resources. And from there, we'll also talk about replays. Resources are very useful for a variety of people. Obviously, I'm looking at a brewmaster, so the two big resources I would look at is hit points and energy. Now, hit points, I honestly don't have a ton of control over, and it's only an issue if obviously tanks are dying when they're not supposed to, things like that. However, this is a much more useful graph for me because I already know that I have concern about how efficient my casts are. And as I can see, I clearly was not as efficient with my Black Ox brew, but he was clearly more resource efficient than I was, right? And I can use this graph to see places where our resource usage differed, and that can be an important way of helping to contextualize rotational differences. Another key piece of understanding any log is to watch the replay of it. Now, there's something important to understand when you're watching a replay. By default, the replay will be the host log. In this case, the log that you did the comparison from. So this would show our replay because I did the comparison from our log by putting in the code from their log. If I wanted to watch their replay, I would have to click on replay back on their log. Replays are really good to watch because they provide a lot of information in terms of seeing both raid positioning as well as potential different ways of addressing mechanics and things like that. It can also be really useful because you can look at things like damage done and get a breakdown of how that player is doing their damage in real time, and then use that to better understand the things you're seeing on the timeline. Damage taken, damage done. This all makes a lot more sense in the context of the replay. The last major piece of Warcraft logs that I think it's incredibly important to understand is that these numbers all mean nothing without context. It isn't enough to just look at a number and come to a conclusion. You have to understand the why behind the what's, or you're wasting your time even bothering going through logs. So, key factors you want to consider all the time. What is their raid comp compared to yours? How long is their fight compared to yours? Did you guys use the same strats? Were your stats different than the person you're comparing to? How were they different? Why were they different? Would that impact talent choices? These are all the kinds of things you have to consider. If you just blanket see that, oh, this guy's using talent X, but he has twice as much haste as you, it's maybe he's using talent X because he has twice as much haste as you. And if you use talent X, your damage will be atrocious. I also personally recommend identify problem areas in your play and focus on those areas individually. If you try to fix too many things at once, you wind up half fixing all of those things, and then you wind up going, hey, look, nothing changed. Well, nothing changed because you didn't actually fix any of those things all the way. You did a partial fix in a bunch of places, and it felt like a lot of work, but you didn't actually do a whole lot in doing it. So take your time. Don't try to get to an orange parse in a week. Fix the little things. Use those things to gradually build into an excellent player. If you have to overcorrect, do so, but understand the consequences of what happens if you do overcorrect. I almost totally forgot buffs and debuffs, so let's go over that really quickly since I'm a dumb. Okay, so buffs and debuffs work pretty similarly to how you do anything else, but I want to go over these because especially debuffs can be a little more complicated. So, same filtering rules apply from before, so I'm going to pull up my monk. The other buffs I'm worried about are their monk. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind is this shows every buff that you gained throughout the fight. So if you're worried about a buff that you casted, you would change all sources to you and the person you want to compare to if you're worried about self-cast. But let's say I wanted to see if either of us were getting defensives, then I would need to pull up their Resto Druid and our Resto Druid, right? So if I change this to be um their druids on us, then I can see, oh, here's all the healing buffs, right, that I got from Cloister, and here's the buffs he got from his Resto Druid. Um, so that's an easy way to filter through, but going into some more detail here, let's filter to the buffs he and I casted on ourselves. As you can see the number of times a buff occurred or was casted. Obviously, if it's a passive proc buff, right, that you'd be looking for occurrence versus casted. Um, Up times though on things, right, that kind of deal. It's pretty straightforward, but the filtering is where people tend to make mistakes on that. Now, debuffs is a whole different ballgame, right? So how if I use the same filters I use for buffs, these would be self-applied debuffs. That's not super useful. So let's go ahead and we'll clear all of this. And then this is going to take a second to load because I just pulled off every single filter. Right, so this is every debuff in the raid. All right, it's a lot. So every friendly debuff on the raid. So if you're looking, let's say you're playing like a warlock or an Ellie shaman, any a shadow priest, boomkin, like all these classes that have debuffs you want to maintain. You need to first change from friendlies, right? You want to click on enemies underneath, right? And if there's specific bosses you need to look at, then from there you can filter. But right, so now we see every debuff that got put on the boss. Now, if you're worried about your particular uptime, then you come here to sources and you would filter to yourself and the person you want to compare to. So now I can look at the debuffs he and I put on the bosses. So my breath of fire uptime was better than his, but his keg smash uptime was better than mine. Right? The details don't matter, but that's a basic idea of how you use debuffs. Um, Timelines and events work the same way. So if you need you get that graphic depiction that way of certain debuffs. So it's a very useful tool. I really recommend using it. That about wraps it up for this basic tutorial of Warcraft Log, guys. I hope it was helpful. Have a good one.